Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello. In this lecture, lecture number 8, we are going to discuss the interface of folklore and nation, how folklore studies refer to this interface, and we try to understand in implication as to how folklore becomes site of cultural politics. And what would be a very good way of starting this discussion then referring to one of the Indian folklorists who has given us a historical overview of how folklore comes into existence, folklore studies comes into existence in India. Jawaharlal Nehru gives us a very insightful idea, and I paraphrase what he has to tell us. He suggests it is difficult to know exactly what pressing political, social, cultural needs or political upheavals of India forced the simple folk narrative of mythological characters such as Rama, Krishna and Arjuna to become the basic frame for a mass mythological, historical, religious and social data, and blend these into the most important narrative epics of the nation and the greater parts of South Asia. However, one factor is very clear, that both the stories of Rama and Krishna must have become Ramayana and Mahabharata respectively when India's cultural identity, nationalism, value system might have been threatened. Handu's this very suggestive, these words of Handu are very suggestive of the fact that threat perception based identity formation can give birth to a very different kind of documented folk narratives. This implies, whatever Handu has said implies, that folk narratives are reconstructed into national narratives in the times of pressing social needs and political upheaval. How are folk narratives and social political upheavals linked to each other? How is the nature, what is the nature of the relationship between folk narratives and various socio-political upheavals? In order to understand this relationship, we need to deconstruct both folklore and the category of socio-political upheaval. Within the South Asian history, the birth of the nation is one of the most important socio-political upheavals with long lasting implications. It is in the context of nation that the relationship between folklore and socio-political churnings is discussed in this lecture. This lecture offers a perspective on the cultural aspects of folklore and the nation, and then builds on the common aspects of these constructs. In the process, we will get to see as to how the notion of resistance and reconstruction is inherent in the constructs of folklore and the nation. We will also explore the interface between folklore and its various forms and the nation. This interface is an abiding feature across the history of colonial and post-colonial South Asia. The quest of roots as part of larger cultural politics and nation building in the post-colonial India drew on the corpus of folklore. Corpus of folklore and the quest of roots came together. Various folk forms aided in the imagination of nation, ideology of nationalism with the due counter currents as a balance. In the concluding part of this lecture, we get to understand the dynamics of cultural politics within post-colonial nations. The knowledge within folklore is the result of experience of the community, wherein folklore contains the collective representation of thought. This is something rephrased from some of the previous lectures that has been delivered as part of this course. For instance, when a proverb is uttered, it expresses the experience of the whole society and not of a particular person. It is only through knowledge of their folklore that the culture of a people can be fully understood. This was an idea which also came in the work of Mazharul Islam, who was discussed in the first 2 lectures in this course. Folklore may be the creation of an individual or a group, but a creation becomes folklore only when it is accepted by the folk or a society. Folklore is seen as a source of identity and pride for groups, as it is a repository of cultural and personal experiences. It provides a sense of familiarity which allows one to feel a sense of association with the group, the village, the caste, the language and the region. And it is in this sense that folklore serves as an exclusionary category, demarcating itself from some other entity. Folklore is not only a way in which a particular community sees itself, but also how it views other communities. And this was an idea very prominent in the work of a scholar of performance studies who has also engaged with folklore, such as Rustam Bharucha. I repeat, folklore is not only a way in which a particular community sees itself, but also how it views other communities. Folkloric attributes are used to create boundary markers against other communities. Folklore represents a shared tradition which is the key criterion for a shared identity vis-a-vis the other. Identity of one group is always with reference to the identity of the other. The cultural in the nation, the cultural component in the nation therefore becomes important to be paid attention to. The nation is the most recent step in the way people have organized themselves into larger communities to manage their economy, to secure their safety, to share their cultural and religious practices. The formation of nations is a modern phenomenon which dates back no more than 250 years, but it is not without its history and predecessors. It has very elaborate history, very clearly marked out predecessors. Empires, kingdoms, princedoms and caliphates have been around for more than 4,000 years, each with its very different form of governing systems, different types of leadership and different relationships between rurals and ruled we have witnessed in these kind of regimes. One can argue that the defining feature of most of these historical forms of governance was a clear separation between the ruling elites and the ordinary people. By the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, the formation of nations started in Europe and Americas. This process of profound change was initiated by new political and philosophical ideas, which identified the people as a source of sovereignty. Subsequently, nations emerged all over the world. The nation became a unique and exclusive form of organizing people. In Latin America and Africa, nations emerged when colonial powers marked new borders on the world map. It was in other parts of the world, it was the new political arrangements such as the partition of India, the former Yugoslavia, Sudan, that created new nations. The construct of the nation is an intertwined and inseparable reality between a people and their identity. This intertwined nature is first and foremost based on the sovereignty of the people, who affirmatively define themselves as the ones giving legitimacy to nation. The nation comes into being by its affirmative act of identification. Without that basis of sovereignty, the nation ceases to exist. Thus, the nation is not simply a set of institutions and instruments that is organized to run a territory. The legitimacy of state institutions and systems presupposes the affirmative action of people who identify themselves with the nation state. Even though nationalism was a product of political upheavals in Europe as discussed above, nations are not only political entities, but can be also seen as cultural communities. Nations are not determinate products of given sociological conditions, but are imagined into existence. And this thesis is very popular in social sciences. This culture is identified, differentiated from other cultures. Its lineage is traced and then is projected as the normative model for the nation. A scholar like Olaisius suggested us. It is in this aspect that the features of a nation can be discussed. A nation consists of group of people who assume a common identity based on culture, and this identity is constantly differentiated from other cultures. The idea of a nation as constituting a folk community was first discussed by German romantics. A German romantic named Herder saw the culture of the Volk, V-O-L-K, Volk, as mirroring the soul and epitomizing the spirit of the nation. The idea of cultural exclusiveness of a nation means the simultaneous acknowledgement of the existence of other cultures and nations. Therefore, as in the case of folklore, nation is an identity of a community vis-a-vis the other. Each nation is a distinct organic unit created by its own peculiar environmental and historical circumstances and different therefore from all other nations. The organic structures of these units were reflected in what Herder called national characters or national souls. A nation must cultivate its own native cultural and artistic traditions along lines laid down by past experiences. A scholar like Wilson would tell us that each nationality carries within itself the standard of its own perfection, which can in no way be compared with that of others. With this kind of basic understanding about nation and its relation with folklore, folk culture, we realize that discussions within folklore studies also give us an idea that folklore could be a site of resistance and reconstruction. And in that kind of context, one begins to rethink the relation between folklore and nation. The enduring popularity of folk tales lies in their potential for social satire within the culture, in their ability to satisfy human desire to see small triumph over the big, to see small triumph over the big and poor and weak overcoming the rich. It is this form of subversion that makes folklore a vehicle of protest. As Alan Duns, the folklorist, suggested way back in the middle of 20th century, if the folkloristic protest is permitted, it is perhaps because it cannot be traced to one person, as it is a collective and not an individual expression. Folklore is a dynamic force in the sense that with the change of social structure and cultural pattern, folklore also takes new shape and form and adopts a new spirit. There exists in folklore the constant and the variable elements which provide its strength to return to traditionalism on the one hand and accept the challenge on the other, accept the changes on the other. So, change and continuity come together. Folklore needs to be seen in the context of social change and its reflection on folklore vis-a-vis the impact of folklore on bringing about changes in the society. With this kind of basic idea, one begins to understand as to how Indic folklore. Indic folklore is full of conflicts reflecting the caste oriented clashes, the religion, god and tribals and non-tribals, and all kind of currents and counter currents appearing in there. The folklore, literature and art of each age reflect the inventiveness of folk imagination as displayed in the creation of new order of deities to help man in the solution of new problems of life. Various forms of folklore do have political significance and potential for social satire. Wherever there is injustice and oppression in a national context, in a socio-national context, wherever there is injustice and oppression, the victims find solace in folklore. Jokes, songs, proverbs become sources of expression of those deeply buried angst of people. Building on folk forms as subversive resource, a scholar such as Mikhail Bakhtin focused on how traces of playful irreverence within the folk forms allows the lower classes to withstand repression in everyday life. Bakhtin says that only within the spaces such as carnivals, marketplaces, which belong to the culture of lower order, can the masses come together to critique all that was hierarchical and authoritative through laughter. The laughter is not merely for instant, short-lived pleasure. Laughter becomes an associated weapon of folklore available with the masses. This laughter that celebrates the dynamism of the collective life becomes a resource against repression. Mazharul Islam elsewhere discussed various forms of folklore, and a long list of that folklore has appeared in the lecture number 1 and 2. It included proverbs, folk tales, revolutionary myths. Say for example, in Soviet era, folk songs of liberation war of Bangladesh, for example, which expressed the retaliation against mass killing and inhuman torture, and those folklore from the culture of Sindh in Pakistan, which registered the grievance of a wife, the songs of rebellion against family norms sung by, say for example, Santhal girls, pastoral songs of Orissa expressing dissent in the social system to show how all these forms of folklore express protest. Looking at such examples, one begins to understand that folklore is a means to protest. It is through various folk forms that the suppressed feelings of those who became victims of oppression can be expressed. Folklore mirrors the society to which it belongs, its joys and sorrows, its emotional expressions and pathos. It is for this aspect of the folklore as the aesthetic form of expression of voices of the folk that someone like Mazharul Islam called it the pulse of the people. Even during the nationalist discourse, folklore became the tool to build and shape the idea of nation on the basis of a glorious ancient past. Folklore was central to the conflict between tradition and modernity that dominated cultural history in the 19th century. This conflict stimulated cultural revivals and underpinned nationalist discourse at the end of the century. Stuart Blackburn, a scholar of folklore, helped us understand as to how this is an important episode in history of folklore and history of nation building. This aspect of folklore as a repository of national identity is going to be discussed in the latter part of this lecture. Nationalism gave rise to most European countries that exist today. The theory was that each nation embodying a shared community of culture and blood was entitled to its own state. This brand of nationalism led to the reunification of Italy in 1861 and Germany in 1871 and to the breakup of Austria-Hungary in 1918. This process of nation building was successful, where governments were relatively capable, where powerful states decided to make room for new entrants, and where the population of new states was not deeply divided. Germany had a capable government and succeeded so well in forging a common identity that the entire world eventually paid for it. Colonial powers formed dozens of new states as they conquered vast swaths of territory, tinkered with old political and leadership structures, and eventually replaced them with new countries and governments, replaced them with modern model of statecraft. Within South Asian context, nationalism as a movement tends to focus primarily on its contest with the colonial power. Historians have amply elaborated this. The nation as an imagined community cannot be detached from the socio-political transitions and understood solely in terms of their modernity or pre-modernity. A crucial aspect of the articulation of any nationalist ideology is the intellectual construction of the nation as a continuity from the past. Therefore, nationalist movements aim to constitute unified cultures, and in order to build and shape the new society, symbols of collective identity are required. Within the nationalist discourse, the unity of subcontinent was woven around the symbols, myths, and values of sacred texts from the ancient past. In this effort, the ancient myths and epics were rationalized as truths of past in order to legitimize nationalist ideology. The process of piecing together the cultural nation began during the last quarters of the 18th century. The values and principles of the social organization of this cultural nation were to be defined and derived through a presumed polar opposition of those of the West. The society was called upon to recognize its uniqueness, to feel a collective cultural pride in its heritage, regeneration and reassertion in modern times. Within the Indian context, the numerous ways in which the British presented India provided the ideological context within which the Indian nationalist self-perception took shape. Vedic Brahmanism as a cultural core, a pan-Indian territorial extent, and an antagonistic polarity with the West became the sacred tenets of the nation to be. This very clearly shows the kind of interface between folklore and nation. Folklore as the domain of values and nation as the domain of national values come together. We have discussed and understood how both these categories are community based entities, nation and folklore. They are both identity markers and therefore they are exclusionary. It is in these features that the interface between the two may be studied. As discussed earlier, nationalist movements aim to constitute unified cultures to build a nation and its identity. Folklore is a repository of national memory and an expression of national soul, and hence lends itself to be used to reimagine a national past. It provides two central motives: the exemplary hero and the organic community, through which nationalist identity is articulated. The community here is a project in the making, which expresses both a mythic past as well as a unique history. The hero articulates an inspiration or revival of concrete set of values thought to be located within the community. Therefore, the hero represents the community's golden age, which is necessary for nationalism to authenticate itself. As it was said earlier, various forms of folklore as expressions of pre-colonial culture were central to the conflict between tradition and modernity that dominated cultural history in the 19th century. This tension crystallized in the first decades of the century, and then as European cultural forces penetrated deeper into South Asian lives, it stimulated cultural revivals and underpinned nationalist discourse at the end of the century. An ambiguity concerning tradition ran underneath the various reconstructions of the past and differed different kind of agendas for reform. On the one hand, folklore represented what modernity would have to leave behind. On the other, it supplied the materials for constructing a nationalist identity. One can recall Rustam Bharucha's discussion on Republic Day parade, and in that Republic Day parade, Bharucha would like to show us all kind of ethnic items on display. Bharucha would tell us as to how all kind of mythological characters would also appear in very modern format, and he would say as to how cultural folk heritage of modern India would be marshalled to remind us about our nationalist identity. It was as a pre-colonial traditional literature that the folk tales had been viewed right from the beginning of the 19th century. They were first brought into the public sphere through print as reflections of Indian tradition. Folklore as pre-colonial tradition was then put to use as a counter example to define a colonial modernity. And Stuart Blackburn has elaborated on this idea of colonial modernity, in which pre-colonial tradition was brought to service. It created tensions in the relationship between nationalism in folklore, for sure. The folklore that was used within the public domain was a sanitized and edited version, like Bharucha tells about the Republic Day parade, sanitized and edited version of folk cultural heritage in a nationalist display. It was high on the colonial list of what needed reform or abolition in Indian society. Alongside social practices such as sati and child marriage, oral narratives, traditional texts, historical legends were also targeted. The blame that their contents were ethically questionable was laid against folk tales. It was further put forth that folk tales inculcate influence by deceit, and that they need to be weeded out from schools where children are young and impressionist. This construction of past as a counter to colonial paradigm inspired the process of reviving traditions and using them as a zone of contestation. In the context of cultural and political domination, language is often the object of derision and suppression, and the narrative forms that are ridiculed as traditional, such as folk tales and epics, become natural vehicles for nationalism. Indeed, suppression and derision only enhance their status as stories of a lost national past. Similarly, in the rush to modernity, tradition was suppressed to the extent that cultural traditions grew into potent symbols of national identity. Analyzing the Bardic nationalism, a scholar such as Trumpiner argues that nationalism is narrowly defined as modernizing project, and that Bardic nationalism presents a complicated psychology of modernity and loss. An ideology was carved out of this lost golden past of the nation, both for present and the future, in order to carve out a national identity and protest against the colonial rule. This interesting story emerges from history of folklore in South Asia, which sheds good amount of light on how folklore could become a site of contestation, how certain part of folklore could be brought forth to combat the claims of colonial modernity. In the discourse of nationalism in South Asia, folklore was used to create this imagined community because it had stood the test of time and was bound to succeed in shaping nationalism and reconstruct the cultural identity and lost glory of the nation. The linguistic, cultural and religious diversity of folk forms, the linguistic, cultural and religious diversity of folk forms confined them to the regions in which they had evolved. Many had first taken shape only in 18th and 19th century. In the process of tracing, understanding and documenting the past roots of folk culture, the importance of traditional folk forms was realized for the purpose of direct communication with as well as creative participation by the people. This led to a turn to folk forms in order to reach out to the masses. However, the pattern of protest and social consciousness as reflected in the use of folklore differs according to the time and context of society. At times, folklore became a source of laying out the basic frame for the value system to be adopted. In the context of India, Jawaharlal Nehru shows how Ram Rajya was a ready-made paradigm for reconstructing the ideology of nationalism and the state. Nehru discusses how Gandhi used all the attributes of Ram and his institution of kingship to legitimize the freedom struggle and also thereby to legitimize new nationalism. However, it is debatable whether Gandhi's nationalism is same as the cultural nationalism of many of his compatriots. At other times, folklore documented personal and national loss. For instance, in some historical situations, the separation from the past is accompanied by possession of those lost identities through lore. Mazharul Islam discussed as to how Tagore molded the feelings of the people against the decision of partition of Bengal in 1905 by composing various songs. One of these songs was actually adopted as the national anthem of Bangladesh. Islam further stated that during the liberation war of Bangladesh, many protest songs were composed expressing the looming threat from Pakistani soldiers. Folklore was revived and rewritten by intellectuals as an act of restoration to preserve a national identity in the era of foreign cultural invasion and domination. In Bengal, the Tagore family provided a connection between the folklore revival and early Indian nationalism. They staged melas, fair, which included display of folk arts and crafts, folk theatre and popular songs. Both print and art were able to give tangible form to the classical, mythical Hindu past that the anti-colonial nationalists sought to inscribe as the origin of India's national history. It is imperative to include the rise of print in any attempt to explain cultural change in the 19th century. In this period, printed books and journalism helped to educate, to inform and to express public opinion, and enabled new usage of folklore in schools and nationalistic debates. Stuart Blackburn has given us very insightful discussion along this line, which shows the interface of print culture and folklore in good in historical frame, and that also gives us an idea of print nationalism / print capitalism. Print led to democratization as it played a role in the emergence of regional languages in India. It led to the undermining of traditional authority figures amongst the lower middle class Bengalis who wished to contest elite culture. It also affected the fortunes of folklore as both living tradition and historical construction. One of the effects of printed folk tales was that they had begun to be used for the socialization of the middle classes. It converted oral peasants, as Blackburn informs us, it converted oral peasants storytelling for adults into a written bourgeoisie literature for children. For folk culture to become a basis for a reconstituted Indian tradition, it had to be transmitted through modern institutions and become attuned to modern scholarship. As being transmitted through schools and universities, these developments led to the dissemination of pre-colonial cultural forms within the masses, a process which a scholar such as Vasudha Dalmia has called the nationalization of tradition. A literary historian, a historian of theatre, Vasudha Dalmia, helps us understand as to how some of these traditional components became available for national purposes. In short, the three primary usage of print stand out: pedagogical, forum for public debate, and enlisted traditional texts in public debate. Firstly, the printed books of folklore found central place in public school system. Secondly, through newspapers, print was used to inform the public and express issues of concerns through publication of letters and new items. Thirdly and lastly, through print, the traditional texts could lend themselves to be invoked within nationalist discourse. By the second half of the 19th century, India had the necessary textual tools, a traditional literature in print, and the required psychological impulse, a perceived loss of tradition. And this all helped to express nationalism as folklore. Furthermore, a colonial context, especially the moral crusades against tradition, increased the perception of cultural traditions under threat. This sense of loss sought restoration in texts of purity and antiquity, restoration of purity and antiquity in texts, because there was a threat that this will all disappear, that there is something coming from outside which will destroy all these pure authentic materials. Our roots will be endangered, and therefore, print was a very good tool to preserve them. Folklore finally found expressions in nationalist discourse in the 1870s. The convergence of two developments in the 1870s is very important. There is a new sense of literary history and public recognition of folklore repositioned as folk tradition and respected as indigenous culture and a symbol of pre-colonial identity. New modes of writing began to trace the contours of the nation as scholars began to write the first literary histories of Indian language. Stuart Blackburn shows how rediscovery and printing of lost Tamil classics at the end of the century spurred several other studies in Tamil literary history and thereby stimulated thinking about the literary past. In order to be conceived as national literature, folklore first had to emerge from indecent tales, indecent and ignorant tales of ignorant folks. It had to emerge from that state to more credible source for constructing cultural identity. This reinterpretation of folklore was assisted by its arrival in India as modern science and establishment of folklore as a field of research. Various folklore journals and societies published more and more collections of folk tales. The folklore texts were currently enjoying a literary and theatrical revival through translations into English and eventually into the vernaculars. This period also saw the rise of many often competing articulations of Indian cultural identity, whether in the English and vernacular language, public spheres, or in the domain of image productions, visual productions. The many reimaginings of tradition included movements to classicize, to Hinduize, to indigenize, to sanitize and to anglicize. However, all these emphasized the representation of an essential Indian culture. In signifying civilizational identity, these newly mobile icons became territorialized once again, figuring forth the nation. And in this regard, one has to remember the iconography of Bharat Mata, which demonstrated the importance of nation to the project of cultural identity. Two separate constructions of folklore and nation emerged towards the end of the 19th century. The first drew heavily on a feeling of cultural subjugation and the second on the sense of loss of village life. In order to reinvent tradition, the nationalists tried to constitute it as continuous and contemporary and therefore located it in village life. They realized the power of folklore imagined as a nation. No other form of cultural expression was more native and so undefiled by foreign influences. Thereby, folklore came to be seen as the repository of national characteristics. However, as Blackburn points out, and one should recall it, it did not become an important vehicle of nationalism as its timelessness was less credible than classical texts and it formed that aspect of the culture which is modernizing an English educated group wanted to leave behind. Folklore had no place in the reformulation based on classical texts of the historic past. In this regard, one has to also recall that folklore, however, was again invoked in nationalist discourse during the populist movement of 1920s and 1930s. An oft heard name, a very important one, is Guru Sade Dutt, who was a member of the Indian Civil Services and was influenced by the revival of folk songs and dances in England, and he felt that the characteristics of discipline and spirit of cooperation could be found in dances of folk groups of lower order and that these were to be raised to the status of a national heritage. It was through an exposure to the West that Dutt and other nationalists became conscious of their own cultural heritage. The movement took its model from European Orientalists, but they did not concentrate exclusively on ancient texts and they included folk culture in their construction of a national tradition. This could be traced to the fact that the movement's primary concern was the constitution of a living tradition. The folk forms that inspired these artists were part of the everyday world. The folk was thought of as the familiar rather than the strange, and thereby they included the urban as well as the rural forms. There is also a post-colonial side to this interface between folklore and nation. And in the post-colonial side, we get a picture of nation building project, which also included instances of resistance. We begin to wonder what happens when the aspiration of the nationalist movement to constitute a unified culture is taken over by the nation state. What are the implications of this unification project when the nation state comprises of diverse social and regional identities? The post-independent interface between folklore and nation in South Asia underlines this negotiation of regional and national values and contestation in the historical narratives of the nation. The ability of a group to form a nation by posting itself as a community is always based on a conflict between different groups and their perspectives on cultural identity. In the process of creating a cultural unity, nations do not address all their members equally. It is imperative to take note of the nation building process in order to understand this idea. Nationalism took roots in South Asia in the form of struggle for independence. The basic objective of this struggle was to overthrow the colonial rule and establish self-rule. The nationalist ethos was represented by the indigenous elite, which tried to mobilize the people against the alien rule, the so-called alien rule. It is a key part of the mythology of colonial liberation movements that the whole nation is seen as having been united and mobilized in the struggle to overthrow the foreign rule. When a colony wins independence, it begins the task of fundamental reassessment of its role, potentialities and structure. Nationalism has triumphed. Where does it go from here? These were the questions. How does one identify nationalism when it is no longer we against them? Before and after independence, nationalism asserts that the nation is entitled to independent statehood, which must guard its separate identity and preserve what has become a nation state from being divided, merged or swallowed up in some other political body, and thereby losing its territorial integrity and sovereignty. The coming of independence and the abandonment of sovereignty by the colonial powers opens the door to the emergence of potentially disruptive forces which may threaten the identity and integrity of the newly established country. The distinctiveness of the newly formed nation can either be preserved by cherishing the traditional culture and institutions and returning to them as fully as possible, or by leaving the past behind and seek speedy entry into the ways of modernity. Thus, nationalism in post-colonial nations is constantly confronted by the dilemma of looking back to the past and the traditional society as distinctive and essential to the national identity, while at the same time looking towards the colonial powers with reference to cultivating rationalism, secularism and scientific outlook. Another injunction which might be held to be inherent in nationalism is the drive to build up among the people assumed to belong to the nation a strong and abiding sense of identification with and loyalty to it. South Asian states lacked the ethno-cultural homogeneity, characteristic feature of nations of the West, which affected a process of fusion to unify people into a political community. It was for this reason that in the wake of nation building, the indigenous leadership had to rediscover threads of homogeneity. During the national movements within various colonies, folklore contributed to the creation of democratic public space to bring the stigmatized, marginalized culture of the colonized people and to include it in the repositories of national heritage in order to make it integral to national memory. This identity formation of folklore, the identity creation aspect of folklore was put to use during the nation building projects adopted by the newly formed nations. In order to move the people towards the creation of national identity, the national leaders needed to build on an ideology that will encourage people to recognize, value and shape their lives according to identity markers of the nation. Folklore was used for the process of nation building in South Asian states. Here, it must be taken into account that in the need to sanction the new by availing oneself of supposed ancestral traditions, there is always a mediation when it comes to any traditional or folklore element. Therefore, what comes to constitute the contents of knowledge or the ideology of a nation is not history or popular culture preserved in the collective memory, but rather that which has been selected, written, painted, printed, popularized or institutionalized by those who have such construction as their jobs. The task of nation building was interpreted in a specific way by the nationalist leaders of different former colonies. These interpretations became a factor in determining an ideology which helped the members of the society, the post-colonial society, to understand and deal with the changing situations. In that period of rapid change, the nationalist ideology operated instrumentally to help people adapt to the changing circumstances. It is in this period of political and social change that folklore in its various forms such as myths, legends, stories and other such items of folk were often created or revised. Every post-colonial nation made an effort to spread as widely as possible the sense of national identity and loyalty. Folklore during the nation building process is often used to reinforce the new ideas, to justify new forms of belief and action and to fortify the newly formed structures and institutions. It provides a sanction and rationale for change. The deliberate use of the school system, usually greatly expanded in the new countries after independence, is presumably the most obvious and most universally adopted device to achieve this purpose, but it is a process which has many other aspects. The usual symbols of the state such as the flag, song and other cultural forms and symbols are manipulated to rouse awareness of the national existence. The armed forces of the state are a dramatic expression of national existence and a sense of security, sense of territorial security, as well as other institutions and bodies are set up on a national basis to create a sense of participation among the people. The advent of all kind of cultural institutions in post-colonial India is a testimonial in this direction. The coming into existence of Sahitya Kala Academy, National School of Drama and various such cultural organizations was also with the vision that the new India would build up itself upon the indigenous, the authentic, the roots, the cultural heritage. The spread of technology, means of mass communication and the increase in literacy as education progresses make it possible for the nation building authorities to reach far larger numbers of people than was feasible at any earlier time. Therefore, during the task of nation building, nationalists concentrated on social issues and ideology and were actively engaged in helping in the production of new works. On several counts, no more vital underpinning can be found for the nation building process than that of the common identity or sense of nationhood forged by the imposition of a common language. One such example is that of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, where Urdu was imposed as the language of the state on the people who were Bengalis. While explaining the effects of such an imposition, Bangladeshi historians have showed us that how modern history folklore has been intimately connected with national issues, aspirations and concerns. Folklore was not only used to rediscover the past, but also to articulate the national issues of the present. The nationalist movement of East Pakistan was not organized against a foreign power, but arose in opposition to an autocratic national government. It mobilized 76 million people in a short time and attempted to realize its objectives through peaceful democratic process. When that attempt failed, the movement called for a war of liberation and within a short time organized a sizable army from an untrained and unarmed people, the Bengalis. From this struggle, a sovereign nation emerged within a period of only 9 months. Bengali folklore played an important role in every phase of the nationalist movement and liberation struggle for Bangladesh. Folk songs reflected the Bengali mood from discontent to political agitation, from participation in the political process to passive resistance, and from non-violent non-cooperation to the bloody war of liberation. In the sequence of each phase, folklore recorded the events, expressed the Bengali spirit and helped inspire the Bengalis to further actions. This is a glaring example of the coming together of folklore and nation and national aspirations. This lecture has given us an overview of how nation feeds itself on the corpus of folklore. However, it also gives an idea as to how certain kind of sites of cultural contestation is allowed within the fold of folklore. With this lecture ends.